she was standing in the wings watching Irene Worth's Madame Renyevskaya, the lead, and Meryl was playing Dunyasha, the maid.
At 60 years old, Diane Lane's story is one of beauty and pain, triumph and heartbreak, a paradox that Hollywood never truly knew how to handle. She was the actress who carried the grace of a classic star, the vulnerability of a poet, and the quiet strength of a survivor. Yet for all her extraordinary performances, for all the times her presence left audiences captivated, her life has been marked by struggles most never saw. Diane Lane's tragedy isn't defined by failure or scandal alone. It is a tragedy because for decades she gave the world pieces of her soul, yet was rarely given the recognition, stability, or happiness she truly deserved. From the beginning, Diane's life was shaped by brokenness. Born in New York City in 1965, she came into the world already caught in a storm. Her mother, a singer and model, and her father, an acting coach and part-time taxi driver, split just days after her birth. The marriage didn't survive, and Diane never knew what it meant to live in a whole family. Custody battles left her passed between parents, her childhood a blur of instability and confusion. Her father raised her in the chaos of city life, moving constantly, often staying in cheap hotels, living paycheck to paycheck. For years, she spent more time in his cab than in an actual home. He was eccentric, brilliant, full of ideas and passion, but unstable. He could recite philosophy and theater theory for hours, but often forgot to put food on the table. To survive, Diane learned early that the world was not reliable. She carried that lesson her entire life. Her mother eventually disappeared from the picture, leaving Diane with her father. That abandonment left scars that never fully healed. At just 15, restless and craving freedom, Diane ran away. She left with a boy, an impulsive decision that reflected how unmoored she felt in the world. The teenage runaway story followed her for years, a reminder that she had grown up too fast in a world that had given her too little protection. When she returned, she found herself working, living with friends, trying to finish high school while already being seen as different, an actress, a girl who carried herself older than her years. The truth is, Diane never got to be a child. By 13, she was already standing across from Laurence Olivier on a movie set. She starred in A Little Romance, and suddenly, the world was calling her a prodigy. Olivier himself compared her to Grace Kelly. Time magazine put her on its cover, branding her one of Hollywood's whiz kids. It looked like the beginning of a dream, but for Diane, it was the end of innocence. Once the camera claimed her, it never let her go. She was praised, adored, and admired, but also pulled into a machine that didn't care how fragile she still was. Hollywood didn't give her space to grow. It consumed her. She went from film to film, swept up by directors who saw her not as a girl, but as a muse. Francis Ford Coppola cast her in The Outsiders, Rumblefish, and The Cotton Club. By 18, she was famous, wealthy, and desired. But fame was a double-edged sword. On-screen romances led tabloids to invent off-screen scandals. Diane, barely out of high school, was written about as if she were a seasoned adult star. Reporters speculated about her relationships, often connecting her with co-stars she barely knew beyond the set. It was flattering, but it was also suffocating. She once admitted that she felt more like an object than a person, more like a fantasy than a human being. The tragedy of Diane Lane's youth was that she carried adult responsibilities before she had the strength to handle them. She was Hollywood's dream girl, but the world around her often confused that dream with reality. She became wary of trust, cautious of fame, and protective of her inner life. She began turning down roles, retreating when the noise became too loud. It wasn't because she didn't love acting, it was survival. She had learned young that no one would protect her if she didn't protect herself. But if the early years were about surviving Hollywood, the later years were about confronting herself. By the 1990s, Diane was no longer the teenage prodigy. She had faded somewhat from the spotlight. Casting directors weren't calling as much. Some critics assumed she had burned out, that she had vanished. But then came her return, quiet but unforgettable. In 2002, she starred in Unfaithful. It was the role that redefined her. Playing Connie, a wife torn between a safe marriage and a reckless affair, Diane poured everything into the performance. The now famous train scene, wordless, raw, filled with trembling emotion, became legendary. In less than a minute, with no lines spoken, she showed the world what real acting could do. It earned her an Academy Award nomination, her first and only. At last, Diane Lane was seen not just as a pretty face or a Hollywood muse, but as a serious actress. And yet, the recognition she long deserved still remained limited. One nomination, no win. A career spanning decades, but never crowned with the awards that often go to far lesser talents. Her personal life, too, carried pain. Diane married twice, and both marriages ended in heartbreak. Her first, to actor Christopher Lambert, gave her a daughter, Eleanor, whom she has always cherished. But the marriage fell apart, leaving Diane once again facing abandonment and disappointment. Later, she married actor Josh Brolin, and their relationship was tumultuous from the beginning. Reports of a domestic violence incident shocked fans. Although charges were dropped, the marriage remained rocky. She eventually admitted to an affair of her own, a confession that stunned Hollywood. By the end, that marriage too collapsed. 2 marriages, 2 painful endings, and once again Diane found herself alone, retreating into the quiet life she preferred. The irony is painful. Diane Lane became famous for playing women in crisis, women who cheated, women who struggled with loneliness, women who tried to find themselves after loss. Yet behind the screen, she lived many of those same struggles in her own life. A runaway teenager, a twice-divorced woman, a mother raising her daughter largely out of the spotlight, Diane carried her pain with grace, but pain all the same. She admitted in rare interviews that her choices weren't always right, that she stumbled, that she betrayed, that she too was human. That vulnerability was exactly why audiences loved her, but it was also what left her vulnerable to judgment. By the time she reached her 50s, Diane Lane had lived a life most couldn't imagine. She had been a prodigy, a muse, a cover star, a mother, a wife, a divorcee, a scandal, a revelation. She had been through it all, and yet she never stopped working. Films like Under the Tuscan Sun showed her at her most radiant, portraying a woman rebuilding her life after heartbreak. That film became iconic for middle-aged women everywhere because it mirrored what so many felt, that starting over was possible, even when you felt broken. Diane herself said filming in Italy was bittersweet. The setting was paradise, but she was consumed with homesickness for her daughter. Even in her greatest professional highs, her personal life often pulled her back into solitude. Now, at 60, Diane Lane remains a paradox. She is one of America's finest actresses, yet underawarded. She has been adored by audiences, yet lived in long stretches of silence, forgotten until a new role reminds the world of her brilliance. She has lived the Hollywood dream, yet never escaped the scars of a fractured childhood, failed marriages, and a public always eager to judge her choices. Her tragedy isn't that she failed. It's that she endured so much pain quietly, gracefully, while giving the world unforgettable art. The tragedy of Diane Lane is beyond heartbreaking because it reminds us of how Hollywood often devours its brightest lights. She was never just a starlet. She was a woman who carried pain in her eyes and allowed audiences to see themselves in her. She taught us that silence can be more powerful than words, that fragility can hold strength, that beauty and tragedy often walk hand in hand. But for all she gave, she was rarely given what she deserved in return. For Diane Lane, the real tragedy is not that she disappeared, but that she was always there, just rarely seen in the fullness of who she was. Audiences often remembered her for a single look, a brief moment, a performance that lingered long after the credits rolled. Yet in Hollywood's memory, she seemed to vanish between those moments, as if the industry didn't know what to do with someone who could not be neatly categorized. She was too old to be the ingenue, too young to be the grande dame, too human to be a typecast. She stood in the cracks between archetypes, and those cracks became the space where her career existed. By the mid-2000s, her films were less frequent, but often powerful. In Secretariat, she played Penny Chinnery, a housewife who stepped into her father's world of horse racing and made history by leading a Triple Crown winner. It wasn't just a sports story. It was a story of a woman stepping into a man's world, refusing to be sidelined, proving that her intuition and strength mattered. For Diane, the role felt close to home. She too had spent her life proving she could stand firm in spaces that didn't want her. The film became a commercial success, but it was her performance that gave it heart. Critics praised her calm, commanding presence, the quiet steel beneath her gentle exterior. Once again, she was embodying women who were underestimated until they could no longer be ignored. Still, even as her roles continued, awards and recognition remained elusive. Other actresses with less depth, with fewer years of work behind them, collected statues and headlines. Diane's performances were too subtle, too natural, too lived in for the kind of flash that award seasons often reward. That is part of the tragedy. Her very strength as an actress, her quiet authenticity, was the reason she was overlooked. She never performed to impress. She performed to be true. But truth doesn't always shine in Hollywood's spotlight. Beyond the screen, Diane's life carried a bittersweet rhythm. She raised her daughter largely away from the cameras, choosing to shield her from the turbulence of fame. Eleanor became her anchor, the one relationship that endured when others failed. Diane admitted that motherhood grounded her in ways nothing else could. Yet even in her most dedicated role as a mother, she had to balance loneliness, heartbreak, and the relentless pressure of public judgment. It is telling that she rarely gave interviews about her private life. Silence became her form of protection, her shield against a world that had already taken too much from her childhood. As she entered her 60s, Diane Lane became a symbol not just of survival, but of quiet resilience. Unlike many of her peers, she did not chase youth through cosmetic reinvention or desperate roles. She allowed herself to age on screen, to carry the lines of time across her face, to embody the truth of growing older in a world that worships the young. This honesty made her even more powerful, but it also made her less visible to an industry obsessed with glamour and reinvention. In that way, she lived the paradox of so many women in Hollywood, most admired when young, most powerful when older, but least recognized when that power arrives. The tragedy of Diane Lane's story is woven into the contradiction of her career. She was the muse who became the mother, the ingenue who became the woman too complex to fit into Hollywood's boxes. She was the girl who once ran away to escape chaos, and the woman who later chose quiet obscurity over endless spectacle. She was both adored and forgotten, both praised and ignored, both iconic and overlooked. And through it all, she carried herself with dignity. At 60, Diane Lane stands as a reminder that true artistry isn't always rewarded, that living a real, flawed, and complicated life can cost you the spotlight but preserve your humanity. Her life is heartbreaking because it shows us how even the most talented can be underappreciated, how even the most radiant can walk through years of shadow. But it is also inspiring because through all the heartbreak, through failed marriages, lost childhood, scandal, and silence, Diane Lane never surrendered who she was. She chose truth over performance, grace over bitterness, survival over surrender. And in the end, that is why her tragedy is unforgettable. At 60, Diane Lane lives quietly, far from the noise of scandal, still working, still mothering, still moving through life with calm dignity. Her story is not just about an actress who never got enough awards. It is about a woman who survived a broken childhood, navigated the cruelty of fame, stumbled through love, and still found ways to rise. She is a survivor, and that survival, though tragic at times, is her greatest triumph.